What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to the final episode of Eat, Train, Prosper for the year of 2022. Bryan and I are going to give a little bit of a recap of the year, talk through pretty much just some of the biggest kind of takeaways for us from the year, things we maybe changed our mind on, were pretty profound moments for us. And hopefully you guys as listeners can find that information helpful as always. Before we jump into the topic for the final episode, Bryan, what's the latest?
Yeah, it's been like 2 weeks since we spoke to you guys, so we miss you, and it's cool to chat again. I realized as I was writing my updates, I had to actually look back at what my updates were from 2 weeks ago because I was like, "What in the world has even been going on in my life?" And then I was quickly reminded by this awful ringing in my ears that I believe is called tinnitus or one of those two.
Tinnitus.
So I actually thought it was tinnitus as well, but 3 out of 4 of the last people I've talked to have told me it's tinnitus, which makes sense sort of because it has a double N, but it doesn't make sense because every other disease is an itis. So I'm going to leave it to the listener and see what they have to say. But
I was gonna say I'm gonna go out on an ego branch here and say you and I are right and everyone else is wrong.
okay, there we go. Well, my mom and dad are both really smart, well-read people, and they both said tinnitus. So,
Yeah, we're probably
so
wrong.
that skews my perception a little bit. But so basically, y'all know I got sick with this awful like hand, foot, and mouth disease a number of weeks/months ago. I was actually curious when I got sick again just recently how long ago it was, and it was actually under 2 months. So this has been by far the worst like fall winter sickness season of my adult life. And I think it makes sense. Like when we actually look at the fact that we've been in some version of isolation in quotes for the last 2.5 or 3 years. We've been wearing masks for periods of time before that. I actually made it through that entire pandemic without really getting sick at all. Like I think I caught COVID, but didn't get tested for it just because I lost sense of taste for 5 days, but that was my only symptom. So I really didn't get sick for like almost 3 years. Then in 2 months, I get sick twice. And this time was a weird one because one thing that is usually pretty ubiquitous across ear infections is that if you have a bacterial ear infection, you get a really high fever. And if you have a viral ear infection from like a cold or, other seasonal sickness type things, you usually won't get a fever or it won't be as high of a fever. So I have these 2 ears like a week and a half ago that are just bugging me and it keeps getting worse and worse, but I have no fever. So I'm like continuing to train and like go about life and like really unaffected aside from the ear infection itself, the pain, and then the kind of discombobulation of where I am in space type thing. But turns out I went to the doctor because Kim urged me and was like, "Hey, this isn't getting better. Like, go get it checked out." And he was like, "Yeah, you have bacterial ear infection in both ears and your right ear looks like it's about to pop." So I started on antibiotics that day, and I'm on day 7 right now, and I still have this tinnitus or tinnitus, and some pressure in my ears too. Like they're definitely not painful or anything, but I think I let it go a little too long because I feel like this is a lingering thing that's pretty shitty. So that is update number 1. A really awful season of sickness. Second, my knee. As I mentioned on 2 weeks ago when we last spoke, I was recommended by my PT to do glute med activation before any of my squatting movements. And I've been continuing to do this, and it's been incredible. Like my knee in the last 2 weeks, I think, has made more progress than it did in like the 12 weeks prior to that since I got the PRP. So yeah, I'm just huge testament to Nicole for telling me to do that, and then to anybody else out there that's having any sort of like knee instability issue at all. What it's exactly supposed to do is stabilize the knee. So the big thing being, what I would notice it would be I would descend down in any squat movement, and like right in the last 3 or 4 inches before I was approaching the bottom, my knee would kind of like wobble side to side, not super dramatically, but enough that I could feel it. I don't know if you could see it or not. But since I started doing the glute med activation work prior, the knee doesn't wobble as I approach the bottom of any squat movement anymore. So that's been huge. And then kind of that self-test that I have where I just love to go sit at the bottom of a squat in body weight. I call it like the paleo chair. And I just kind of like to sit down there for a few minutes a day. I'm actually having a number of times where I go to do that where there is no tugging or pulling or anything like that. Sometimes there still is. I don't know exactly what affects it, but at least there's some times where I do it and it's basically like I'm back to new. So, and then I have some updates on some programming things for my program and for Paragon's program, but let's jump over to Straker because he's in Bali right now and I want to hear all about this.
Yeah, so officially back in Bali. My girlfriend Jenny and I will be here for a year. We have a year lease. We have a year Kitas, which is it's kind of like a temporary residence permit. I would imagine similar or akin to like a derivative of a U.S. green card sort of thing. Super excited about that. Brian and I were talking off air. It was rough traveling, and this was my fault 100%. Jenny was like, we need to buy the flight. We need to buy the flight. We need to buy the flight. And I was just like, I don't know why. I was just dragging my feet. I was like, we'll do it later. I'm too busy with work stuff. And then there was only like one kind of flight option left. It wasn't like terrible, but it was still rough days. So we had like 6-hour flight from DC to San Francisco. Then we flew from San Francisco to Taipei, which was 15 hours. And then we had another 6.5-hour flight from Taipei into Bali. And then we had a 4-hour, essentially cab ride or with, a car to get to the villa. So it was just like brutal. And then spent the weekend. Like I'm very much so the person, like I will immediately sacrifice to try and like, I want to get back to my like routine, right? I thrive on my routine and I really hate the longer time away from it. So we got in essentially like Friday night, all day Saturday and Sunday. I was just like mowing through checklists of like upgrading the internet and having someone come install different things, like going into town, renting our motorbikes, like setting everything up, getting like set up, ordering desks, chairs for the office sort of thing. So that hopefully by like, once we're here, like a week, I will be like cruising altitude again, like back to just mowing through work and training and all of that stuff. So it's been hectic first couple of days, but the one thing I will report is I've done it 3 times now. So I feel like it's not coincidence, but something about being here, it like shifts my time schedule forward. Like 8:30 rolls around, I'm getting yawny and stuff, which is going to be interesting for the podcast because we're recording at 9 p.m., my time. But then I'm up at like 5:30, 5:45, like naturally, and I'll lay there and be like, can I go back to bed? And I'm like, no, I'm just up. And that's what's happened every single time I've come to Bali. Like, and it's the only places where it ever happens where my like circadian rhythm just shifts into like that specific setup.
Interesting. I noticed that in the winter versus the summer. And so like with the time change that we have, like that 1 hour time change, it like really affects me even more than the hour that it should, to the point where I go from waking up naturally at like 6:30 to waking up at like 4 or 4:30 or something like that in the mornings. So like for our podcast today, I set an alarm for 5:30 to get up, but I was up at 4:15. So it was kind of like just a non-issue,
Yeah. It's really wild. And then let's kick it over to you for work updates, because then I have one big work update that I'm very excited to finally share.
On my program, it's kind of cool that I can talk about like what I'm doing with my training and then have it also be what's happening with my program that I offer on the app. So for my programming, we're currently at this moment as of 12/20. We're in the beginning of week 5 of what's going to be a 6-week mesocycle. And these aren't actually weeks. They're like week and a halves. But so there's like maybe 2 or 3 weeks left in the hypertrophy mesocycle that we're doing. And then I am jumping into what will be called a 3 to 6 week strength phase. And I haven't done one of these since the fall of 2021. When I did it in the wrong way and I didn't enjoy it at all. We've talked a lot about this on the podcast where I still had that emotional tie to like my low bar back squat and my conventional deadlift numbers. And yeah, percentages are a tough thing when like your 1 rep max deadlift is over 500 pounds, or it used to be. And then you're like, yeah, triples at 80%. And that doesn't feel super light. So I kind of beat myself into the ground pretty quickly in that cycle. But this time what we're doing is we are going to focus on staying mostly in the 4 to 8 rep range, 4 to 7 for most things. So there's going to be a lot of the benefits of the strength cycle, I think, come down to resensitizing to certain movements and certain rep ranges. But since I tend to train in relatively lower rep ranges anyways, like 5 to 10 is usually my norm, and we're just shifting that to like 4 to 7. I don't think there's going to be a ton of resensitization that occurs from rep ranges, but I am taking out a lot of movements. So the programming is going to be 3 times a week, full body, which I'm really excited about just from like a opening up time in my life perspective. And I am essentially choosing like one movement for each body part twice a week. So like if I have quads, for example, there'll be like one day with pendulum squat and one day with hack squat. And then I don't even think I have a leg extension in there at all. For hams, I have one day with an RDL and one day with a leg curl. And I am eliminating the 45-degree hip extension. And then same deal across the upper body. There's like 2 days of the 3 that will have a chest movement, 2 of the 3. Actually, I think every day has a back movement just because the back is like the lats, the back, the rear delts, all the different things. And then I think there's only one day with any arm work at all. And I think I'm doing those like also in the, 5 to 7 rep range or something along those lines, like, standing hammer curls. So I'm really excited for that. I'll get into the next thing in a second, but Paragon's programming also has some cool stuff dropping in the winter. So like in the January for the new year. So the way that the cycles are working out is we're finishing up an 18-week hypertrophy program right now. And so the next thing in sequence is also a strength cycle for Paragon. And so January 16th, we're jumping into a strength cycle there. For Paragon, we program these strength cycles a little bit more in the lowering rep ranges, like the 1 to 5-ish range, because we really like to give people the opportunity to express their strength, set new PRs, things like that. Most of our members aren't 25 years into their training journey, and so they are actually still kind of setting PRs, and it's really cool for them to be able to show off all that hard work. So we love programming those cycles with an approach to a 1 rep max. And then because not everybody wants to do strength, and because we know that as far as nutritional periodization goes, that it's probably not the best thing in the world to be working up to a 1 rep max if you're in a calorie deficit. And we know that a lot of people jump into a calorie deficit in the new year, whether it's to be, leaner for the spring and summer, or whether it's like a New Year's resolution or something along those lines. We created a specialty 8-week hypertrophy cycle that starts whenever you want to start it. So the way it's created is instead of it being like on a specific date, like most of our programs run on a calendar, this one is like a special program that you can just add when you're ready. So if you join our program January 2nd, you can start at January 2nd. If you want to finish the hypertrophy cycle that ends January 15th, and then you don't want to go into strength next, but you'd rather do this special hypertrophy cycle, then you could start this special hypertrophy cycle on the 15th from the beginning without having to like backdate the calendar or anything like that. Yeah. So anyway, those are kind of some of the options we have there across, the various programs that we offer. So pretty much something for everybody, regardless of what your goals are in 2023.
Before I jump into mine, I just wanted to say, like, kudos to you and LCK for pretty much like saving people from themselves. Because I mean, there's a time when I was strictly nutrition, right? And I'm like, I don't want to take the training. I don't feel confident enough in my skill set there, sort of thing. But that's something that you will find a lot of people do is like people will run like, we're in a calorie deficit. We'd be in like the deep end of a 12, 16-week calorie deficit. And I find out like my client was running like a Wendler 531 or something like that. Why? Right. Why are you doing this? And sometimes people just don't know. Like, you don't know what you don't know. And like I said, just shout out to you and LCK for like, hey, this is just foresight, right? Of it's a new year. People have resolutions. People are going to want to improve body composition, drop body fat. They're going to be eating less. We probably don't want them 1 rep max deadlifting, right? Because you're decreased capacity to recover. You're at a decreased capacity to perform and express maximal strength. So really, really cool there from you guys.
Thanks, dude.
Okay. I am so excited to share this. This project has been underway since like July. And then by the time this episode releases, we will have released like the intro format. So myself and Jackson Peos, who is a coach and PhD out of Australia, have a project launching that is called the Online Coaching Upgrade. It is aimed at aspiring coaches and novice coaches who want to get into and grow within the industry the right way. So the first cohort will release or will open and start early February, late January, and it is 9 education modules, and then also every system that I've ever built to run my business is included in it. All the systems that Jackson uses to run his business are included in it. And you get basically, and then at the end of the 8 weeks, we have like a live open roundtable call as well. So if you are someone who's very new, green to the space, or interested in entering, this is a very, very well put together project from myself and Jackson that we've been grinding away on for months. And I'm very, very happy to be able to finally start releasing public information about it.
That's so awesome, dude. I'm so amped for you. I, of course, had no idea that this was happening in the background. I knew you were working on something big, but Jackson is obviously somebody like that's pretty well known in this space. His content and his research is extremely well respected. So how did you actually connect with him and get this whole project going?
So, I mean, Bali is one of the places where people like you get a lot of like influencer type of people and different things because it's very Instagrammable per se. I ended up just at dinner with Jackson one night through like a mutual friend. And then we just were talking about like work and coaching and stuff. And we realized we were like really, really similar. Him and I just like got sushi another time and we're talking about business stuff. And he just like pitched this idea. He's like, listen, this is a fantastic thing. And then the person that I had previously mentioned a few weeks back that I had been hired as like a consultant to move like a coach onto these systems was Jackson. So that was like a big project, and it was really, really cool to see like someone, okay, we have an existing, large client roster. What are the things to do? Like, these are the things that we want to make sure are done like really, really well. And it was really cool for me because, I mean, obviously like the Done-For-You client check-in system is out there, which is a part of Upgrade. And then the only other tool that I had out there was the muscle gain and fat loss models, which are obviously in Upgrade. And what thing was really cool there is prior to me ever meeting Jackson, like his muscle gain model is in the model that I built.
That's awesome.
And so it was really cool for him to just be like, oh, I built this thing based on like all of like your logic that you put out in this book. And yeah, it's been really, really cool to just like, okay, it kind of helped me with like some validation because it was like so much in entrepreneurship. It can just be like you on an island. And I'm like, I just built these things that I needed to help me stay organized and all of these things. And then as it is getting into hands of other people with established businesses and stuff, it's just been like pretty cool to see it can help like more people. And I think this is going to be a really, really great project in the space that I think that the cornerstone is of like integrity. I think especially for people, younger people coming in and stuff, there's a lot of like what I would consider kind of like dishonest practices, right? People are like, okay, here, join this program. You're going to make $10,000 a month. And like, people don't really know how to coach yet and all these things. And they're super, super expensive programs. And it's just kind of like, I don't know, it doesn't sit right with me. So I'm really happy to be able to like do something about it, and that we're giving you like the educational resources, but then also like, here are the systems to run your business, like take them and implement them. And I think it should be a really fun and fulfilling project on just numerous fronts for the both of us.
Yeah, dude, I'm super amped. Really, really excited to see how this all plays out for you guys.
Yeah, so we probably won't put anything in the show notes or whatever, but you can find information on myself and Jackson's Instagram, and you can also visit the onlinecoachingupgrade.com where you can like drop your email and stuff for when we do officially launch.
And then you just posted on your story about this gym in Bali that had this amazing leg press last time you were here, and the range of motion was insane. And it looks like you said they replaced it with a seated, like horizontal leg
like
press.
a selectorized seated leg press. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's pretty absurd. So how do you feel? I mean, how do you feel about that? Are you going to stay at that gym? Like, talk to me about the gyms in Bali. What are you doing?
So that was a gym that I would go to like 1 day per week because they had that leg press, but they also have like an old techno gym leg extension that is like ungodly lengthened overload for leg
Mm.
extension, which is cool because the other gym that I would go to, the leg extension has to be one of the worst designs for a leg extension ever built. Like the thing that is so absurd about it is the pad that you sit on, right? Like
Yeah.
that it's like 3.5 feet long. I'm like, who did they build this for? Fucking Sean Bradley? Like no one's femurs are this long. It's just,
Right.
but and then it's literally just like the only range of motion is short on it. Like you can't even get
Mm.
to a 90 degree on it.
Okay.
Another gym just opened that is going to be almost exclusively outfitted with Arsenal strength. However, their equipment isn't coming in until mid-February.
Mm.
So I will be back at Body Factory, which is the gym I went to last time. Yeah, and there's like another one opening too, and I might like bounce around a little bit. I think eventually I'll probably pay for two, which will be absurd because the gym prices here for like the nicer ones are they're like I just paid for the first month at Body Factory. I think it was like $180 US for the month.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like one of those like boutique gyms here that would have like a sauna and a hot tub and a steam shower and like all that stuff.
Yeah, they do, but that's another upgrade to the. I don't even know what that month is, but because I paid for it last time and then I went once, so I'm like, okay, well, not going to do that.
It must
again.
be so expensive to like ship in all that equipment though to Bali from
Yeah,
insane. I can't imagine the initial startup cost of something like that.
you have to be very well funded, but I mean,
Yeah.
people are paying for it. It is a very interesting business model now to see how it's grown and stuff since the first time I was here.
I'm done.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to jump into the topic?
Let's jump into it. Yeah. So, like I said when I opened it, we're just going to have a discussion on kind of a year in review and some of the biggest, more notable things for us that we either changed our minds about or just really, really happy and kind of have been profound for us that we wanted to share with you. So, first one is updated thoughts on reverse drop sets. You want to kick us off there, Bryan?
Yeah. So I basically phrased all of these as like updated thoughts on. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily mean on all of these that I did a complete 180 or we did a complete 180 or anything like that. It's more just like, hey, these are things that we've talked about throughout the year on the podcast. And here are some thoughts that I may have that are slightly different than how we originally talked about it. So the reverse drop set was something I was like super big on, maybe even more than a year ago. Because I was talking about reverse drop sets with Helms on the episode we did with him, which was like August or September of 2021. So it was like a year and a half ago. But reverse drop sets have been something that I've been like super intrigued by for a while. And essentially what a reverse drop set is you take like a short overload movement. I always love to use the example of a cable row because I think that is a perfect short overload movement where it's short on the strength curve, meaning your body just gets weaker as your hands get closer to your body. And it's not as short as like a dumbbell row would be, in that like at the bottom of a dumbbell row, there's not actually any tension, whereas in a cable row, there's some. So it's a little more even of a resistance curve, but the strength curve is short. Either way, that doesn't exactly matter. Essentially, the reverse drop set is that you take a set to 1 or 2 reps shy of failure. It can't be actually 2 failure or it doesn't really work. And then you quickly add 20% weight. So maybe you have 100 pounds on the cable stack. You go to 8 reps to 1 to 2 RIR. And then you quickly shift the pin to 120 pounds and you continue again. And you more or less try to match the reps that you achieved on the first set. So if you got 8 full range of motion reps, you would get 8 on the heavier set, but you would understand that maybe you get like 1 or 2 full reps and then the rest are partial reps where you attempt to get a full rep. I used reverse drop sets for a really, really long time in my program. And part of the reason I was super intrigued by them was this whole idea of biasing the length and position of a movement that kind of lacks sufficient tension there. But over time, as I've continued to use these reverse drop sets in my programming, I also started incorporating something that I've been calling a lengthened set, which is basically the same thing as a reverse drop set, except instead of doing it immediately after the first set, you would take like a full 2 to 3 minute rest and then do it. In comparison to a reverse drop set, I think that the lengthen set provides a couple distinct advantages. One is that you can actually take your full range of motion set prior all the way to failure because you have that full rest. So you don't need to leave anything on the table in that first set. Second, you can go heavier potentially on the lengthen set because you have that 2 to 3 minutes rest. So oftentimes it'll be more of like a 25 to 30% increase in weight instead of that like kind of 15 to 20% that we use for the reverse drop set. There was another one. Oh yeah, and cardiovascular fatigue. So that was one of the reasons. Like I was a couple months ago, I was just sitting there doing a reverse drop set, and I was like, man, I am so gassed from this first set, the full range of motion set. I was like, I'm going to go into this reverse drop set right now, but I'm not going to get as much out of it as I could. And so kind of in that moment, I had the realization that the lengthen set is just better in every way. And that's when I kind of worked backwards and realized that, you can take the first set to failure and you can use heavier weight in the lengthen set. And then you're not cardiovascularly or psychologically fatigued going into it. So you can actually like have a better mind muscle connection and focus more on the movement itself when doing it as a lengthen set. And so in the past, I also used lengthen sets, but I would use them as a progression where it would go like first we'd do partials, then it would be reverse drop sets, then it would be lengthen sets. More recently, I've kind of just gone from partials directly into lengthen sets. I like this approach much, much better. I think that it's significantly more productive, and I've started doing the same thing with clients, and it's still kind of like a nice transition piece that I'm using in general programming to throw in like 1 week of reverse drop sets before going to the lengthen set so that the general population isn't like slammed by this idea of like, now we're going to increase the weight and see what happens. It's like, hey, we did some partials. Now let's take this like intermediary step and then we'll do the lengthen sets in the subsequent weeks. But those are kind of some updated views I have on that.
What I really like there, and what I think would be really helpful, is if we try and just give the listeners like a very practical approach. So, with how you're approaching it now, are you still trying to, okay, I did my first set, second set, whatever of full range of motion reps, I'm going to go to failure. Do you try and match your reps again on the lengthened overload only set that is after the full rest?
Yeah, I do. And so that's actually a really good question. And, it's okay if I don't sometimes. Like, usually it works out that I do. So there's a couple examples recently where I would get like either 7 or 8 reps on the full range of motion set, and then I would jump into my lengthen sets and get, usually it's 2 full range of motion reps at the heavier weight, and then it would be 5 or 6 partial reps. There's certainly cases where like some movements that aren't super duper short overloaded, like I think a chest supported T-bar row is an example of this, where despite the fact that it is more short than lengthened, there's still quite a bit of tension on your upper back when your arms are hanging and you're like just like braced over that pad,
Yeah.
And so I find oftentimes on that one that I either have to take a smaller weight increase. So instead of 25 to 30%, usually 20% is pretty good, or else I just have to expect that I'm going to get fewer total reps and it won't necessarily be like a match to what the full range of motion set was. It's a good question. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions on that?
Not so much a question, but I think in this, again, like following up on kind of the last episode where we talked about individual considerations for like nutrition, one thing that I know is very, very true of myself. Like I am someone who's very well slated for the reverse or the kind of lengthened only set, because my rep drop off in drop sets is astronomical. So when times a lot of people program like, oh, a 20% drop, like I'll do like 10 reps, drop 20% and get like 3 reps. And then so that's something that I've always like really known about myself. In order to get at least like 5 or 6 reps, I'm generally dropping like a 50%. And I don't know if that's from a neurological thing. It doesn't feel very cardiovascular. It's just like, it just starts to fall off super, super hard. So for something like this, it gives me a full rest again, and then more time in that lengthened position, which for a majority of body parts, we can't unequivocally say all, It's just more tension, more time spent in the longer muscle lengths. So if you find yourself like me, a very, very, wise approach for yourself as well.
When you do rest pause sets or myo reps or whatever sometimes, right?
I've been doing them a lot like this week, since I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to try and follow like my program that I was. I'm not mentally capable of putting together a new one yet. I'm going to go in, have fun, train, and try and get in and out. And just, I've been doing like myo reps and stuff. Yeah.
How much rest do you take from like the main full set to the first or second or whatever? What are your rest periods between the rest pause sets?
I generally do like 5 big long breaths. And when
maybe 20, 25 seconds.
Yeah, about like 18 to 23, I'd say.
Assuming you're working in the 6 to 8 or 8 to 10 rep range, what would you get? What do you usually get after? Like, say you do a set of 8 to failure, what would you get on like those little rest pause sets?
3s is like, if I can go 3 through, if I can get 4 rounds of rest pause at 3, that's pretty good. But
with like an 8 rep first set or like a 10 rep first set,
like a 9 to 10 first set. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
So
that's kind of that supports what I was thinking as you were talking about the rep drop off, in that you do tend to run a little bit more fast twitch in most of the areas in your body. You know, Jeff Hain? Yeah. He has a podcast, and so I'm actually working one-on-one with him right now, which is super cool, as he's kind of trialing some of the methods that I use. And what I've noticed with him is that in his upper body, he's getting like he'll do an initial buy-in set of 10 reps, say, and then he'll get 6 and then 5 or something like that on his rest pause sets. And the other, I think he got 11 and 7 on one of his movements. And I asked him about it the other day, and I was like, man, this is so wild to me. And we both kind of realized that it probably is because he has this like proclivity to just grow legs without even really having to do anything. So we assume like his legs are probably a little bit more fast twitch dominant, and he's always struggled to build mass in his upper body. So we kind of deduced that maybe he's a little bit more slow twitch in his upper body. But I'm more like you, where if I'm somewhere in that like 9 to 10 rep range on the initial set, I'm like 3 reps on the rest pause. And if I'm like in the 6 to 8 rep range on the first set, then I'm only getting 2 on the rest pause. So I think that's an interesting point that you brought up, and probably another, for sure, good reason that somebody would opt for a lengthened set over a reverse drop set. The next one that I had was updated thoughts on ways to bias the lengthened position. And so this is kind of a continuation of the first, because that first thing on reverse drop sets versus lengthened sets is certainly biasing the lengthened position. But what I wanted to discuss here was some things that I have only just begun using or haven't used very commonly in my programming. And so the one that I have been using this entire cycle that I've discussed on prior podcasts is what I'm doing on my 45-degree hip extension, where I'm attempting to set a different range of motion as my target range of motion. So if you think of that 45-degree hip extension as you're fully bent over the pad and your hamstrings are stretched at the bottom, and then you come all the way up so that your torso's in a completely straight line and your glutes contract at the top. And what I'm trying to do to bias the lengthened portion of that movement more is create a hard stop at around 70 or 80% of the range of motion, essentially right as my torso passes gravity, horizontal, because the movement gets super duper hard at that point, and a lot of the tension shifts off of the hamstrings and into the glutes as we pass gravity. So that has been quite challenging, but it's something that I think has a lot of utility. It kind of forces you to have to create a bit of self-awareness in your body control too. And so as I've gone through the process week to week, it's been interesting to try to understand the difference between what it looks like on video and what it feels like in my body as it's happening. But it's cool because like I was saying, you really develop a better connection with your body through doing this, whereas you're so programmed to like do a full range of motion all the time that you actually can really kind of learn something about yourself aside from the benefits of actually training at longer muscle lengths and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to add too much onto the back of this one just for kind of time's sake, and because there's a lot of really good things I want to get into, but that, like what you were just describing there, it really is like the awareness and understanding the bias that you are attempting to I guess bias is a poor choice of words there, and just understanding the movement and what you're actually using that movement for is huge. And that's one of those
Yeah.
things that generally just comes with training age, because you've just spent more time like kind of paying attention to your body through movement and creating that connection, I guess.
And then the second one that I have used in the past, actually, I used this a long time ago when I first started working with Cass, maybe like a year and a half or two ago. He recommended that I incorporate like some 1.25 or 1.5 reps as a way to bias the lengthen position. But I kind of moved away from it because it sucks. It's really, really hard. And so I think that that's something that's going to make an appearance back into my training and into group programming in future cycles, because it's really a really great way to spend more time in the lengthen position. So already, like, I think pauses in the lengthen position are something that's basically ubiquitous. Like, I kind of expect people to pause in the lengthen position on every movement, more or less. But now if we can pause in the lengthen position, only come halfway up or a quarter way up, basically just initiate movement from the bottom, but then go back to the bottom again immediately, then we're getting all of this extra time spent in the lengthen position. And so I think that there's benefit to that, especially on compound movements, because you can't do like lengthen sets, as I would say, where you're just doing like bottom range. They're a little more complicated to do on something where you actually won't be able to stand up and complete the rep when you get tired. Like, you can't imagine doing a back squat where you're like, I'm just going to do the bottom quarter reps until I can't do them anymore. And then you're like, oops, what now? So I think that doing something like a 1.5 rep on a lengthen movement, like a pendulum, a hack, a back squat, something like that, where you go down, you come halfway up, you go down again, and then you go up, and that's 1 rep. That still gets you to the top. You can still kind of use RIR and be like, hey, we're going to go to 1 to 2 RIR or whatever the intent is, and you know that you're not going to get completely buried at the bottom. So yeah, those are kind of 2 ways that I think we'll continue to use the lengthen position here.
All things that I agree with. I think are very great revelations to me this year as well.
Next was something I was just recollected of yesterday. I reposted to my story a post that I made in July, and it was a updated thoughts that I had this summer on the cardio idea and concurrent training. This has kind of been building throughout science for the last couple years. There's been a number of studies that have kind of referenced concurrent training and whether it has deleterious effects on muscle growth and strength. But I had been experimenting with it a lot throughout the late spring and early summer before I tore my plantar fascia. I was starting to bike a lot and incorporating that more towards the end of that period. Actually, you know what? It was kind of toward the very end and then into the early summer, because what my views are on here are that cardio or concurrent training is probably extremely useful if you're in a maintenance or a surplus of calories. But still, do I stand true to my initial statements of years ago that were that it should just be a tool that is pulled when you need it during a deficit? And so that was kind of how I was using it at the time, is I didn't really do any cardio in the first 2 months of my 3-month diet. And then as latter spring approached, I was getting leaner and leaner, and I needed to pull the trigger on kind of just creating a little bit more caloric deficit. That's when I began kind of the biking and the additional movement in there. And then after I came out of the deficit, tore my plantar fascia, I couldn't walk anymore. I really went hard into the biking thing and ramped it up a lot over the summer. I kind of did this as a personal experiment because I wanted to see how far I could push the biking, like how many days a week and how intense I could do it and how close in proximity I could do it to leg training and have it still not impact my strength progressions. I was very surprised that being in a significant caloric surplus, doing intense biking 3 or 4 days a week, had no effect on my strength progressions. And when I did it even on the same day, so I tried it twice where I would either do it before a leg session and then come back and do legs, or I would do legs and then do the bike ride after the leg session, and still noticed no negative effects from the cardio on my leg training or my progressions week to week. And so, at least for this N of 1 experience, what I've kind of realized is that, hey, if you're in a caloric surplus, or if you're eating enough to be at maintenance, meaning that you have to account for the calories that are burned during the cardio to get you back to maintenance, that it doesn't really seem to have a negative impact. And I think that that's really cool information for people that just, hey, enjoy cardio. Like, I just love going out for a run or a bike ride. Or those that are getting older and want to still maximize muscle growth, but also want to, keep your heart health and your VO2 max, and like kind of some of these more important things that, decrease as we age.
My thoughts on this specifically are much, much more aligned with the latter of what you just kind of wrapped up on. This year, more than ever, and I'm sure this will probably continue to happen as I get older. Unfortunately, can't really change that. I have been having a really hard time kind of siloing like training and, physique apart from like health sort of thing, because it's the age old testament, like to cardio or to not cardio sort of thing. And I do think a little bit more like as you learn more and continue to dig and start getting labs and stuff like that, I think objectively, right? Let's say, okay, you're in a mass gain, bulk, whatever you want to call it. If you're to pull labs at like peak bulk, they're not going to look good because you're like purposefully overfeeding yourself to put on weight. Things like lipids are probably going to get worse. Insulin sensitivity, fasting blood glucose, all these things like these, generally important health markers. Granted, yes, it's just a response to the environment that you're creating, but I think like for years I was just like took a blind eye to it and like was like, no, why would I want to do cardio? Like I don't need cardio, or maybe I'll use it when I'm dieting, but now I'm not. And now like I said, it's hard for me to separate that. So I would say like even more in the winter times, or when I am like gaining, that was one of the things that I was excited to come back here and get access to like a stair climber again. I'm like, hey, I want to do it like twice per week. 15, probably going to start at 10 minutes. I'm not going to lie, so I don't fucking fall apart. But it's kind of what I'm getting at. Like I'm in from a body composition standpoint, I'm always in great shape, but I wouldn't really say I'm in like a cardiovascular shape at all. Like there's times where I'm like, I'm kind of fucking huffing and puffing for no good reason right now. And when those things start happening, like maybe I do need to, hit some cardio and stuff like that. Sometimes I just want to get really sweaty. So that was something that I've definitely kind of shifted gears with harder this year. I was one of those coaches who was always like, we're never doing cardio, it's unnecessary sort of thing. And now I'm just like, is it necessary for an overwhelming majority of people? No. Will it help us move the needle within the proper context? Like, yes. And maybe you have a deadline of like, hey, I have this whatever bachelor party I want to be ripped for in like 10 weeks. Then like, yeah, we're going to do some fucking cardio to help us further facilitate that process. So I think I just became a little bit more, I should say less judgmental to its utility for when the context warrants it.
Yeah. I still hold strong, I think, to the idea that if you're doing cardio too early in a diet, or just too much in general while dieting, that it is going to have some impact on your strength training and your progressions and your recovery. And like, these are all things that you really have to be careful of when you're in a caloric deficit, because you don't have the recovery capacity to recover from all the training you're doing plus additional training. So like my default in a diet is still to have people cut calories first, focus on strength training, and if and when we reach a point where we can't really go much lower in calories and you can't continue doing more steps, then at that point it probably makes sense to use a little bit more of that like middle intensity or high intensity cardio to elicit additional caloric deficit, but something you have to be very careful of. Whereas I just think if you're at maintenance or in a surplus, you have so much more freedom with how much cardio you want to do, because then you can just eat more food to compensate, and it kind of equally balances out, and there almost isn't that recovery deficit that you end up falling into when you're in a deficit.
You really did hit the nail on the head there. In a surplus, cardio is kind of like a health safe gap sort of thing, whereas like in a calorie deficit, it might become like the complete antithesis of what you just used it for in the surplus.
Yeah.
So environment, as always, is paramount to the utility.
Love that that's something now that kind of seems to be supported by science too, because I forgot how much I love that. Like, as you said, you just want to get sweaty, but that like endorphin feeling of, finishing the cardio session and just being like, oh man, like just so rewarding. It's a very unmatched feeling when it comes to that. So something that I'm glad that I can incorporate in, more throughout the year as it starts to get nicer and things like that.
Definitely.
So this next one shouldn't be too long, but it's updated thoughts on metabolic cycles. The more that I go through training others and training myself and talking with other peers in the industry, I just don't know if we need them anymore. I kind of think that it maybe has a utility for small periods of time, like we've talked about, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks at the end of a strength cycle would kind of be the place that I would put them, where it would be like, hey, we're pretty deconditioned right now. We just shifted all our rep ranges lower. We even started resting longer. We lowered volumes. We reduced training frequency, kind of some of the things that happen during strength cycles in general. So maybe like there is reason to improve conditioning after a strength cycle so that you can then facilitate a better hypertrophy cycle. But I don't think that you have to do a metabolic cycle in the sense that you don't have to superset large compound movements back to back. Like you don't have to go pendulum squat to bent over row as a superset. You don't have to do things like little mini circuits or anything like that. I think that you can get a lot of those cardiovascular benefits that you're looking for and like the work capacity benefits by just adding in some cardio for a few weeks. So it's not that metabolic cycles have no use, but it's maybe like it's a pick your poison kind of approach. Instead of having to use metabolic cycles to do like cardio with weights, sort of, you could just continue to lift weights, but then do some cardio. And so that's an approach I'm still kind of toying with, but something that I think probably may have more utility as far as programming for the masses goes. It's often difficult to construct cycles in a commercial gym where you're having to move from one piece to another piece quickly. Of course, you can be creative and you can do, like I said, like pendulum squat to bent over row, where you bring dumbbells over to the pendulum squat and then you can do that, whatever. But a lot of people just don't like that noise of having to piecemeal things together like that. And so I know I don't. Like, I would rather just do straight sets in the gym and rest and move to the next movement. And so if I can get some of these work capacity benefits that I need by doing 10 or 15 minutes of cardio at the end of my training session or a different time throughout the day, I think that would be preferable for me. And I know that a lot of people I've talked to would feel similarly.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you there. I'm okay being wrong. For what it's worth, I love being wrong because then I get to learn, right? Personally, I don't like the utility of them. I had that one that I ran when I worked with Alex Bush earlier this year. I think that was the period of it's very uncommon where I like very strongly dislike training. I hated it. And it was very strange where like, again, I think this also plays into what we talked about earlier in the episode with my just like kind of, let's say like lower than average, maybe muscular endurance, but I'd have to use such a light weight to be able to complete the reps. I felt like there was nothing to recover from, and it was a very strange period. I'm generally not going to be programming that with clients, like, except for the sole use case of someone who comes in overweight, health isn't in a great spot, and we want to improve health markers, right? We want to get fasting blood glucose down. We want to get fasting insulin down. If we have like insulin resistance, and maybe they needed to eat like a very low carbohydrate diet, but they don't necessarily want to because of how limiting it is, or because your food volume's lower and that isn't great for satiety and those sorts of things. Like, you can use it as a tool to help just shuttle a bunch of glucose uptake into the muscles, using a lot of like your larger muscles. But then again, we're not talking about body composition, physique. We're talking about getting you back to a baseline of health so that we can transition into more productive like hypertrophy training sort of thing. So there, I think the utility is quite applicable, but for probably, 8 out of the 10, 8.5 out of the 10 people listening to the podcast, like, yeah, I don't think you may ever truly need that.
Yeah. I think maybe it's important, as you were speaking, I realized I didn't distinguish between metabolic cycles for systemic versus like local musculature. And so I think the way I was talking about not needing metabolic cycles was definitely based more on systemic. Like you can just kind of increase your cardio to increase your systemic ability to do work capacity and cardiovascular endurance and things like that. To the point of what you were saying, there definitely probably is some like small utility to doing the local metabolic phases in the glucose piece and insulin sensitivity. And then also potentially in making that muscle specifically better at endurance, if that's something that's important to you within the paradigm of your training, like doing those leg extensions, those IRMs where you take your 15 RM and then you do sets of 8 until you die with like a 30-second rest in between. I mean, that's the sort of shit that, like, if it doesn't make your quads better at quad endurance, it makes your brain better at dealing with pain. For that, I feel like there may be utility, but to be completely honest, when I program, I usually program stuff like that in throughout hypertrophy phases, like here and there. So instead of having like an entire period of time where we're just doing local musculature metabolic work, it's like, hey, we're having a hypertrophy cycle and maybe part A and B are straight sets of compound movements. And then part C is like a leg extension IRM or something like that. So I think that maybe for that purpose, there is a little bit of utility, but it maybe doesn't need its own cycle necessarily.
Again, very, very well said. I think there is utility in using like IRM stuff to make sure, like, you not necessarily make sure, but to like help you keep your edge or help you like develop an edge of really, really pushing yourself sort of thing.
Yeah.
Again, bringing that out in small parts as parts of hypertrophy cycles. I think, again, there is a solid utility there.
All right. Well, this one you added at the end here. So it's updated thoughts on volume and intensity. So I'll let you kick it off and then I'll pick up from there.
Yeah. This one, there was someone who was DMing me, asking me questions. It was a listener to the podcast. And he was like, hey, he asked me a question. He's like, hey, I'm thinking, I've been thinking about like volume versus hypertrophy or versus intensity. And I think I'm going to like take everything. I'm just going to go a high intensity, lower volume approach and just take everything to failure, like back squats and deadlifts and stuff. And I was like, absolutely not. But it really made me kind of think through of like having to explain it to someone else around like the kind of note that I boiled it down here is like, the more experienced you are, more intensity in a lower volume approach is probably going to have a better application there. The more you want to gain experience to become more experienced, you can gain experience through doing more volume, which is just getting more practice at doing it. The thing that there was like an example that I thought of, like, okay, we have a novice like painter or something like that. They can paint their masterpiece, but it might take them like 40, 60 hours or something like that. The like 50-year-old career painter can paint his same masterpiece that maybe took him 50 hours when he was 20. He can probably do it in 5 now, right? So it's the same kind of thing. Like, you have to put in the reps literally, which comes through volume, to just learn how to control and contract your body forcefully enough and really start hitting reps with intent instead of just completing things. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is something that this year was the year where things really, really finally clicked for me at like almost all of my body parts, little things like I'm doing, like a prone incline rear delt row. Like, I can feel my rear delts contracting. Like, I know that arm path is like locked in. In years prior, I would just be like, okay, I'm leaning over the thing of this approximate arm motion, just go, Mm-hmm. And I think it's one of those things where what's really kind of interesting there is like, you don't know you're there until you're there. And I can tell you that's not a very helpful statement. And to kind of give what immediately popped into my mind when I was doing this, back when I first got into lifting, I really wanted to be able to like move my chest. And my stepdad could do it. And he just told me, he's like, you can just do it one day. And I was like, what the fuck do you mean? Like that's not helpful. And then like literally I was probably like 16 or whatever. And one day I could just like do it. And I was like, he wasn't lying. Like there's one day you can just do it. And I think it's just like a good kind of silly but accurate representation. It's like you don't know that until you're there. And I think if you are younger, still maybe 5 years of training or whatever, which I would still not even really quite considered advanced yet based on my own progressions, unless you had like an incredible tutor and was really kind of brought through. Run the volume until you realize that if you continue to train at that volume with your new capabilities of intensity, you're going to fucking fall apart. And that I think is when you can realize, like, I can't do 5 really hard sets on a hack squat, or I can't do any other exercise that day. And then I'm not really reaching my thresholds for other muscle groups and stuff that I needed to train. So I think realizing that was a very, very big, vital one for me this year.
I feel like that's why the journey of volume throughout the stages is like, when you're a dead novice, you don't need much because shit, you do one set of something and you get sore for like 4 days. But quickly, maybe in the first 6 months or so, you graduate from like super novice to just like novice / early intermediate or whatever it is. And then you're in the intermediate stage, you're a novice intermediate, then an intermediate, then a late intermediate. And like throughout that entire journey, which is 5 years probably, I think your volume for the most part is going to be significantly higher than it is either in the beginning of your journey or thereafter. And it's for those reasons that you mentioned. Like, it's almost like, in my mind, one of the defining ways of you being advanced, if we look beyond just how quickly you progress week to week, is when you realize that the volume you were doing was absurd because you're now just so much more accurate. That's like a huge telltale sign of, okay, I'm kind of graduating into this advanced stage right now. And we see this across everybody, man. Like fucking 3DMJ just did a podcast on this where Bryan, Miner, Nunez, and Brad basically just spent an hour talking about how they do half the volume now that they were doing 3 or 4 years ago. And these guys aren't even like, it's not like they were intermediates 3 or 4 years ago. Like, they were advanced. They were just stuck inside this evidence-based ramp of volume ascent, which we all realize is just now. When that first Brad Schoenfeld study came out, that was, up to 45 sets per muscle group was better than 30 sets, which was better than 18 sets, which was better than 9 sets or whatever it was. And everybody just started like jumping on that volume train. Like, how can we cram more volume in? Like, I think those guys at 3DMJ, like, they sort of fell for it too. It was the pervasive belief for a number of years in there. And it's only really in the last couple of years, as we've become so much more meticulous in assessing these studies and understanding the individual variation that occurs within inside of them, that we've actually realized that it actually isn't volume that is driving all of this. It's doing the right volume for you with the amount of effort and accuracy that you possess. And so it's always like you said, it's always that delicate balance of volume and intensity. And it is no surprise to me that all of my peers in the industry have lowered their volumes down over the last 2 to 5 years or 2 to 3 years, or however you want to look at that kind of time frame. So I'll just tease it real quick, but I was in a chat, as I am, with Abel and Dave like 2 weeks ago. I just started thinking about all of these studies that we have, and how these days it just seems like the end result of the study is just like, hey, it doesn't matter, like whatever, it doesn't matter. And so I coined this term evidence-based nihilism, which is basically just like, whatever you do, it doesn't matter until you look at the individual data. And so that's one of the cool things that studies are doing now, is they're not just releasing the conclusion on like a population level, but they're showing you what happened to each participant within the study. And so when you delve into these individual reactions, you can see that it doesn't matter is completely false, because it matters a whole ton. It just matters a whole ton to you, the individual, and not as much on the group level. So that is the project that I'm working on now for our next episode, which will be sometime in early mid-January. And hopefully I'll have some cool data to discuss as we go through that.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that one. That's something that we didn't tuck into the episode, but that was a big one for me this year. And I think it's a really, really great part to wrap up on. The fact is, like, reading research is really difficult, and it requires like a substantial time investment to really get a grasp of what you're actually looking at, and understand that, like, hey, the abstract or the conclusions or suggestions, whatever, like, they are reporting population means and averages. And you may find yourself within that, population average. You might be an outlier. And if you're that outlier, those findings like that, that it could be really, really important for you. It could be a big nothing burger, but until you can really like dive in and dig in and see that, again, it's population averages, which applies to the greatest, range of people. That is mostly helpful for everyone, but you may find that it is not particularly helpful for you if you are an outlier.
One quick clarification there is that an outlier is an extreme on either end. And so if we say 15 sets per week is like the mean average that works for most people, an outlier would be like 30 plus or like under 5 or probably even less than 5 or over 35 or something like that. Like it would be huge, right? So you don't have to be an outlier. You could be 25%, you could be in the 25th percentile or the 75th percentile. And that would even have a dramatic impact, where if you're in the 25th percentile, you would need, say, 7 or 8 sets instead of 15, or 22 or 23 sets instead of 15 to be an outlier. I mean, you're like so far on the spectrum that it's like 2%. I think an outlier means like 1% on either end or 2% on either end or something like that.
I can't remember specifics. Yeah.
It's something really small like that. So you could literally be just part of the general population, but be slightly skewed one way or the other way. And it still matters a lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, just kind of some closing
semantics. No, semantics are definitely important. So thank you for bringing that up. I think maybe in the new year, it would be a great episode to like bring someone on like with like intimate knowledge of research who's maybe participated and could help us, walk through kind of some gotchas and stuff like that are maybe common misunderstandings. I think that could be a cool episode.
Hell yeah. I dig that. Let's think about who.
Cool. So as always, guys, thank you for listening. Thank you for making year 2 of Eat, Train, Prosper continued success. This has grown into something that I honestly never imagined it would. So thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you to Bryan as well for being a part of this. And we will talk to you guys next week, the week after, whenever it hits. The week after, we are going to take off the week between Christmas and New Year's. So early 2023 for the start of Eat, Train, Prosper, year number 3.